Dr. Neil Howe was on True News in early 2012. He's on the telephone again today for another interview. He is a renowned authority on generations and social change. As the president of Life Course, he is a consultant to major corporations about anticipating social changes. Dr. Howe, welcome back to True News.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, sir. It's been a couple of years. I think it was early 2012 when you were here. I read the book Fourth Turning during the Christmas holiday week of 2011, and I haven't stopped talking about it ever since. Presently, there are people alive representing 6 generational cycles. The oldest ones are the remaining members of the World War I GI generation. They're
World War II, yeah.
Yes, they're in those are the people who are in their 90s. And so we're down, the various other groups, the baby boomers, Generation X, the millennials, and so forth. Which one of the groups is presently the most dominant generation group?
It depends on when you're looking at generations and looking at dominance, each generation roughly is the length of a phase of life. So if a generation dominates midlife, say, say age 40 to 60, if you want to identify midlife, then another generation is kind of young adulthood. Another generation is sort of, elderhood or senior leader position. And right now it's pretty clear. Boomers still have, are moving. Are really beginning to move mostly beyond midlife and kind of the senior leadership position, and their numbers are now in rapid decline in Congress. In terms of presidency, they're still relatively young. It's not inconceivable that we could still have, one or two or more boomer presidencies. But nonetheless, they're now the senior leadership position. We still have a lot of boomer CEOs. But boomers are more kind of beginning to migrate to the board of directors, you know what I mean, of churches and nonprofits and corporations. And they're beginning to edge out the silent generation. These would have been the children of the Great Depression and World War II, came of age in the 50s. And the silent are beginning to move more into their 80s. And the generation really kind of coming on as truly the leaders who are really in charge of institutions and sort of day-to-day decision making is Generation X. Right now they are, I think about age 33 to 53. I mean, that truly is sort of the prime age adult, working cohort, right? Mm-hmm. And they're the ones raising kids. They're the ones who have families. They're the ones who have teenagers. They're the ones now beginning to send their kids to college, and we have a new generation, obviously, of millennials who are but increasingly entirely recast what it means to be a young adult.
How does Generation X differ from their parents' group, the baby boomers?
Well, the parents of Xers, are dealing with 20 year social generations, roughly. So their parents would have been in the previous 2 generations. So, a lot of early wave Xers born in the early 60s have boomer parents, right? And a lot of Xers born in the late 70s would have they would have silent generation parents. Born in the late 70s, you'd have boomer parents. So the way it works is each generation tends to have their own children born over the next 2 generations, kind of in a bell curve. And as we've often discussed, though, it's the second older generation which plays a decisive role in your upbringing. So for boomers, it was really the World War II GI generation. It was very formative when they were growing up in the 50s. They were, Walt Disney and the Ed Sullivan Show, and then they declared all the, they were the leaders of the Vietnam War and Watergate and Nixon and Westmoreland and all those guys as they were coming of age. So their kind of struggles, as it were, with the older generation was really with the GIs. A lot of boomers had were the children of the silent generation, but these were younger parents at that time, and they didn't have as much influence. I would say for a lot of Xers, the generation that was really in charge in the 70s and 80s when they were growing up was the silent generation. These are the peers of Bill Cosby and Sandra O'Connor, and they tended to be a very hands-off generation of parents. These were the children, the latchkey guide children, right? The self-care guide kids, and I would say they're leading very different lives. They define completely different life stories. The silent generation grew up as kids during the Great Depression. They were strictly raised. They were very well socialized when they were young. They were very risk averse in the 50s and early 60s. That's how they got the name silent generation. They became they made long-term plans in their careers at a very young age. They got married and had kids young. And they've done very well economically. This is the only generation that ended up getting those defined benefit pension plans, right? And their highest savings years, savings for retirement, really started in the early 1980s, and for the next 20 years, that was when they were saving for their retirement, probably the biggest boom in American history, right, in terms of both the stock market and the bond market. Interestingly, the last cohort of the silent generation, born in 1942, they turned 65 in 2007. Now, that's timing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect, right? You cash out that year.
So they were fortunate enough to grow up and have their prime living years at the peak of the American empire.
Well, yes, and they were big savers at the right time, and they generally had high wages relative to older workers back in the early 60s. Everything went well for them. For those of you who recall a famous musical of the 1950s, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, or the old Woody Allen expression, right? 80% of life is just showing up. It's funny. I go and I talk to Xers a lot about that, and they don't even get the joke. 80% of life. It's not even funny. What are you talking? Not in my world. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And Xers have a completely different life cycle in terms of the economy. They grew up at a time when people weren't really thinking, caring much about kids. In the early 80s, we had all these reports coming out about how badly kids have been educated, how little they were cared for, and how dire would be their condition in the global economy. And then we had the two-tiering of union jobs and basically a stagnation of anything but four-year college degree professions. Starting with that generation. So they were a generation very much totally unlike the silent, pushed to grasp for risk, very much oriented around free agency and risk-taking throughout the late 80s and 1990s. A lot of them went into debt to try to keep up with the standard of living of older generations. And then come 2007, and we just actually presented a paper at the Fed policy conference here in D.C. on how each generation is done economically, and particularly when you look at the data coming out of the St. Louis Fed, which investigates a lot of this in very detail by cohort. Gen Xers are hands down, according to these data, the ones most negatively affected by the crash of 2008, 2009. They bought into the stock market late, when the prices were high. They bought into the real estate market late when prices were high. They tended to live in ex-urban regions where the price declined the most. They were really wiped out. Xers remain, even today, more likely to be underwater in their mortgages than any other generation. And they're struggling. This is also a generation where a higher share of them have withdrawn from the labor force. So, when we look at why the employment to population numbers remain so low beneath still today where they were in 2007, the biggest reason is these people in their 30s, 40s, and early 50s still have not come back into the labor force. So this is a generation under huge economic pressure. A lot of them are getting subsidized by their silent generation parents. I mean, you look at the extended family get-togethers today. They're being funded by the grandparents. Grandparents are the ones setting up college trust funds for the kids of these families. So here you have anyway, you asked about the differences.
Now, it's fascinating to me because I'm listening intensely to what you're saying about Generation X and the impact the financial crisis has had on that particular generation. Generationally speaking, can they ever pull out of it? Is there enough time for them in their earning years that they'll be able to pull out of it?
Well, that's exactly the question I've raised both in St. Louis and here in D.C. at these two Fed conferences I was at. And I would say, because I would say so much is today being talked about millennials, and millennials have had it tough. Yeah, this has not been a great time. Millennials, their sort of entry into the labor force is almost completely defined by kind of the post crash years, and it's been very difficult. On the other hand, millennials have so much more time ahead of them, right? To regain, their balances. Millennials are adjusting in a very healthy way. They're beginning to save at a much earlier age. They're joining 401k plans earlier. They're deliberately not taking risks. They're delaying buying houses. Their credit card debt has gone down. Their auto debt has gone down. Their mortgages have gone down. They're living with their parents longer, often to save money. And I think they're getting it. They're readjusting their life plan, and they have a lot more time to make up the difference. Xers don't. And you raise an excellent question. I would say Xers, and to some extent very late wave boomers, people who are today in their 50s, even late 50s today. Late wave boomers didn't do nearly as well as early wave boomers, and there are real questions about how tough things are going to be. I'll tell you one thing, guarantee, is 10 or 15 years from now, retirees, people who are retired over age 65 on Social Security, are going to have a much weaker middle class. A lot fewer of them are going to be able to afford those active adult communities, and the whole stereotype of what it means to be an older person will change pretty radically.
What do you foresee for people who are retired 20 years from now?
Well, I mean, one thing is, today when you think of the silent generation, you think of someone in the early 70s, you think of the silent generation, you think of a very strong middle class, you think of monogamous couples who've been married all their lives, you think of very little racial or ethnic diversity. The silent generation had less immigration than any other generation in American history. So they tend to be, socially, racially homogenous, very well socialized, very civically engaged, educated, very well educated, generally in good health, have had good life habits all their lives. And that's going to change. When you get to late wave boomers and then, a few more years, even a bunch of Xers begin to pass 65, you're going to see a much weaker middle class. You're going to see you go into an older person's home, it'll be either, dollar store or I don't know, restoration hardware, there'll be nothing in between. And you will see a lot more ethnic diversity. You'll see a lot more diversity of family types. A much higher share of Gen X women never had children. Here's an interesting statistic. From those born in 1940 in the early 1940s to those born in the early 1960s, childlessness among women has gone from 10% to 20% at the end of their childbearing years. So a lot more people don't have any women. So you'll find kind of elective communities where they'll just form with others, communities, no longer those kind of, very much more marriage-oriented institutions that we find still so strong and prevalent today among the elderly. You're going to find a generation that's less attached to political institutions and civic institutions, because Xers have never been as attached to them. They'll be more likely to just figure out a way of. Xers are very resilient. They're very if if you run into a problem, figure out your own way of solving the problem. Don't necessarily ask. You can't really trust anyone to take care of something for you. So the idea of calling, your local public, social service representative or congressman to come in and solve a problem is going to be much further from their minds. So anyway, we could go on here, but there's going to be a lot of differences.
Are you acquainted with demographic researcher Harry Dent?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we used to talk actually back in the 1990s. I remember when he was first working on his stuff, and I'm pretty familiar with it.
Okay, all right, yeah, because he comes on the program from time to time, and he's in talking about the American economy coming out of the doldrums, he said, there's the engine simply doesn't have any juice to do this. He said there are more dyers than buyers.
Well, that's for sure. And
he said, who's going to build new houses? Who's going to build new cars? Who's going to build new washing machines? There are more people. The baby boomers are dying off, and there are fewer buyers than there are dyers.
This is having a big impact. I mean, I often talk to people about real estate, and it's interesting. There's a very simple way of looking at real estate that I think often eludes people, and that is when you think about the total demand. We see that number coming up every month, right? New housing starts, right? And in the decade before the crash, it was between 1.5 and 2 million new housing starts per year. I mean, that was a pretty flush time. And then it went under 500,000, in the first few years after the recession, and it's still not really reliably every month over 1 million. Right, and there are a lot more multifamily units being built. That's done fine because a lot of the kids are coming into the cities, but overall it's not reviving. And the simple fact is that we've become an older population, and the people who are older are beginning to die off, are almost cancel out all the younger people being born. And the best way to look at housing is just look at change in the number of adults every year. And you don't have that many new adults coming on that really is all that much greater than older people that are now passing away, which means the total difference is immigration. And the biggest shift that's happened over the past 6 or 7 years has been a huge fall in immigrants. I don't know if people are aware of this, but immigration from Latin America, which was huge in the 80s and 90s, right? It was over 1 million a year in illegal immigrants coming in, has completely dwindled down to very, very little. The largest immigrant group in terms of ethnicity is no longer Latin American, it's Asian. And I think very few people are aware of that. This has happened just over the last couple of years. Last 5 years we've seen the change. But the result is that you think of the housing market as musical chairs. You can have a lot of people selling and buying to each other, but at the end of the day, the net demand for new units is going to be how many new adults you have. And in today's demography, if you have this huge reduction in immigrants, that's the only margin by which the number of adults is expanding.
Is that the real reason Washington won't do anything about immigration? Because they need the immigration flow to keep the economy going?
Well, I frankly think that what we do politically on immigration and, our immigration policies have much less impact than just basic changes in fertility, mortality, and trends, not only in the United States but abroad. The biggest reason why immigration has been low since 2007 has nothing to do with the United States. It has nothing to do with what we do. I mean, we can argue about fences and deportations and all. I'll tell you why it's happened. It's because in the 1980s, you had a huge fall in the fertility rate throughout Latin America, and particularly in Mexico. So that if you look at people who are between age 15 and 30, this is the high immigrant population group. That's the age at which people generally migrate, right? These people now between age 15 and 30 in Mexico come from much smaller families. You no longer have the third, fourth, sixth son of these large families. They no longer exist. And so this is why...
So nothing's stopped or slowed down the migration flow, except there's nobody to migrate.
particularly those, you can imagine these large families, just economically, there was no way to support them. And I think to some extent you've seen a little bit of growth in Mexico, particularly of some of the same millennial trends you see here. The public sector and politicians caring a little bit more about young people and making sure they have jobs and universities. I know there's all the new auto manufacturing plants and so on in northern Mexico where a lot of these people are working, and financial firms around Monterrey. In other words, the country's a little bit more fun. We hear about the drug killings and kidnappings of young people and all that, but we still notice today also a lot more solicitude toward the needs of young people in Mexico. But the bottom line is this, that we've seen enormous demographic shift in fertility throughout Latin America, resulting in much smaller families. And I guarantee you, we tell our clients this, you are never going to, even if the United States economy goes back into full acceleration mode, we are never going to see illegal immigration streams for Latin America like we saw in the 90s for the foreseeable several decades moving forward.
I heard a disturbing piece of information a week or two ago from one of our guests. His name is Mr. Tattlebaum. He's a bankruptcy lawyer in Fort Lauderdale, and he represents investors and creditors in retail industry bankruptcies. And in the course of the conversation, he said the most prevalent retail trend right now in America is he's seeing people who can no longer afford to shop at Walmart are now migrating to Dollar General.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few years ago, Walmart was considered that was the lowest price place you could go to shop in America. And what he's saying is that there's now a significant number of people in America who can't afford Walmart.
Right.
That's not a good sign for us.
No, it's not a great sign, and it's camouflaged a little bit because Dollar General and there's been a big merger there, obviously, but it's everyone understands there's a lot of revenue flowing through those stores, and the problem is it would be a sexier market for people to enter if the profit margins at those stores were higher, but they're not. No one wants to be selling mostly to the absolute bottom of the pyramid because they're generally associated with very thin profit margins. But you're right. I mean, that's kind of where our economy has been in the last few years.
I want to go back to the fourth turning. The last time you were here, a couple of years ago, we were talking about America has now entered the latest fourth turning. Briefly recap for our audience that doesn't know anything about your work. What are the characteristics of the fourth turning?
Well, the fourth turning is like all turnings as we define them. It's an era that's about the length of a generation. So it's about 20 years or so, 20, 22, 23 years long. That which is characterized by a certain kind of social mood. So certain sort of attitudes toward risk-taking and family and civic trust and so on. I mean, each of these, and we see four of these kinds of turnings in American, through many centuries of American history, and they roughly come in the same order. And the second turning tends to be times of great emotional, I should say, cultural and values upheaval. And like we have in the 60s and 70s and some of the great awakenings in American history. And at times when we reconstruct the inner world of vision and values. The fourth turning, by contrast, is kind of the opposite. It's also a crisis era, but it's when we kind of reconstruct the outer world of institutions, economics, politics, empire, those kinds of things. And they tend to be very outer focused. We're not worried about values. We're sure of what our values are. We want to actually we are threatened by a hostile world, and we want to create new institutions which are able to guarantee those values or vouchsafe those values in a world which seems newly dangerous externally. And are the great fourth turnings of American history are eras like the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil War, the American Revolution, and so on going back. These tend These have often been characterized by total war, but in any case, I don't think they need to be eras of war, but they are certainly characterized by a sense of enormous public urgency and a gravitational collective desire to reshape institutions from the ground up in order to save the country.
I've interviewed other experts in cycles, and one particular cycle that we talk about often is the war cycle.
Yeah.
Does the war cycle coincide with the fourth turning?
Well, yes. I mean, if you talk about, as I just mentioned, all of the total wars in American history have all occurred in fourth turnings.
And we're in a fourth turning right now.
Right.
So there are. Yeah. It's not written in stone that there's going to be a big war, but
the risk of total war is certainly much higher in a fourth turning than in any other time. Yes.
So we're in the fourth turning, and according to war cycle experts, we're in the war cycle. So we are looking at a time of high probability of a major war. There's also a civil unrest and revolution cycle, and according to the people I've talked to, these two cycles, the war cycle and the civil unrest cycle, have not overlapped since the 1770s, and so that's happening right now, and that's why we're seeing a lot of social unrest around the world. We're seeing separatist movements and states and provinces trying to break away and go independent and so forth.
So it's interesting to think of you think of decades that have parallels to them, and certainly you see so much today that has so many resonant parallels with the 30s, right? You think of the secular stagnation, which is a term coined by an Alvin Hansen in the late 1930s, and a coin that's revived by Larry Summers today, right? Sort of chronic under-demand, under-supply, a chronic underemployment, underutilization of capital, a period of deflation, which was a big fear in the 30s, trade wars, competitive devaluations, which have come back today. But also when you look at the global geopolitical scenario, the 30s was a time at which there was no great global power or any great set of treaties, that, Congress of Vienna kind of thing that was ruling the world. It was a time of sort of a global lawlessness when rising authoritarian regimes increasingly were doing what they wanted to do, whether it was, Germany or Japan or Italy, right? Outraging the world's conscience as to what they would do. All of these have parallels. It was interesting. In 2012, Obama, one of his slogans was economic patriotism. I thought was really interesting. I mean, that would have fit in perfectly in the 1930s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even some of the more social and cultural changes in the 30s, I think, have real similarities today.
Yes, economic patriotism. He's referring to if you have money in an offshore bank, you're unpatriotic and you need to bring it back.
Yeah, or a business abroad, or relocating businesses at home, and doing all that kind of stuff. But it's so the receding, the kind of retreat of globalism, which is certainly over the past 15 years has been one I think around the world has been a hallmark feature, whether you're looking at Asia or Europe or the United States. But there are a few other interesting trends. The decline in the fertility rate, along with the lousy economy, certainly characterized the 30s. Interestingly, there are some positive trends in the 30s that we have today. The huge strengthening of family life in the 1930s, which I think we're seeing today. The rebirth of the extended family, which is one of the most remarkable features today that people hardly ever talk about. But a much greater share of people living in extended families, and young people and their parents, even grandparents, getting along together better than they ever have before.
Because the economy is forcing them to come back together.
Partly the economy, and partly they just get along well. I mean, you cannot go out and talk to boomers, with their first wave millennial kids, without just realizing they're on the phone all the time. They sync their iPods. They wear the same brand name clothing. They talk about their personal life all the time. I know a lot of millennials, even after they get full-time career jobs, they continue to live with their parents just to save money. Believe me, this did not happen in the 70s. And, where the boomers are completely culturally alienated from their World War II winning parents. The post-war, the moment in our history where the fewest share of 25 to 34-year-olds living with their parents was in 1980 when boomers filled that age bracket. It was 11%. Today it's back up to 23%. That's partly the economy, but it's not just the economy. It's these generations today, because we're no longer in a second turning, we're in a fourth turning, and this is characteristic of the change. You see a much more complete disappearance of the generation gap in terms of values and culture between generations today, which is one of the reasons generations get along well today with each other.
So they're yearning to reconnect.
Yearning
families.
to reconnect, and it's one aspect of that. Here's another parallel. In the 1930s, we saw, after the very early 30s, with Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and some of that, we saw a huge decline in the crime rate, which is generally driven by the GI generation as young adults. What have we seen over the past 15 years? A huge decline in crime in the United States. In fact, I would say millennials, and this is, no one likes to say good things about millennials, but I will right here, that the millennials as young adults have been responsible for the most dramatic decline in youth violence in American history. We've seen a 70 to 75% reduction in serious youth crime since the early 1990s, when millennials began to move into their early teen years. And this is nothing less than amazing. There are whole areas of inner cities you can walk around in today. I don't know
what accounts for it.
I live in D.C. I go to New York.
What accounts for this?
It's a generational shift. Millennials are brought up to be these special kids who are fussed over by their parents. Much smaller share of them were unwanted, and they were given a sense of purpose. They said, we don't want you to do something bad in the eyes of your friends and bad in the eyes of your parents. We want you to live up to these standards. They're all on their social networks, all on Facebook, and so their behavior gets monitored by each other. It's a very different kind of generation, and like all generations, no generation is good or bad. It just has different traits which function differently. But we've seen with what we call this kind of archetype, which millennials belong to, one of their defining attributes is a decline in crime. We saw that with the GI generation. We've seen it earlier generations of that type throughout American history, and we're seeing it again.
Okay, when I interviewed you in 2012, I think you said that we entered the fourth turning in 2008.
Yes.
Do you still hold to that view?
Yeah.
Why do you believe that it was 2008?
Oh my gosh! I mean, it was a political rupture with the election of Barack Obama, and more importantly, it was a free fall in our economy, and a bursting of a bubble for which we are still suffering and we still have not gotten out of. And I believe that our attempts to get out of it and our repeated stumbles and I think further downdrafts in both the stock market and the economy that we have not yet experienced is literally going to define most of this 20-year era that we're living through. Another parallel with the 30s, you might say.
Why do you choose 2008 and not 2001?
Well, first of all, because I think that several reasons. One is generational. Every new era occurs when each new generation is entering a new phase of life. So 2001 was too early. Millennials were not yet entering young adulthood. Boomers are not yet retiring. You know what I mean? It wasn't. And you can look at the fourth turning to see how we identify turnings. But typically, the real mood shift occurs when each generation is beginning to adjust and beginning to enter a new phase of life. That was occurring in 2008. That was not yet occurring in 2001. And I do think the shift in the national mood after 2008 was more profound than the one after 9/11. I'm not saying 9/11 wasn't a mood shift, and to some extent anticipated some of the change that sort of the people no longer expected, maybe the end, this idyllic end of history, after 9/11 hit. But I still think there was a lot of the certainly in the economy, the shift really didn't occur that we're looking for in the terms of fourth turning mood, in terms of family life, risk taking, the need to roll back on globalism, the increasing rise of the new localism and the search for community and all this. I think that became much more profound after 2008.
Okay, now each fourth turning has a crisis stage. Does each fourth turning crisis stage become progressively more severe and dangerous?
You mean?
Okay, the last fourth turning was a crisis stage was World War II.
Well, there were kind of several crises actually along the way. If you want to look for peaks and valleys, certainly one of them was 1932 and early 1933 when FDR took over it and declared a bank holiday and so on. I mean, that was a huge black point. And then obviously what happened after Pearl Harbor was sort of a different kind of crisis, right? It was a crisis-filled era.
But was that period more dangerous and severe than the previous one, would that have been the Civil War era?
That would have been the Civil War. Kind of hard to get worse than the Civil War. That had by far the largest war casualties as a share of the population, even in absolute numbers, than any other crisis in American history. Something like 1 out of 4 fighting age men in the southern states were killed. I mean, that was an enormous crisis.
All right, so we're now in the latest fourth turning. Have we entered the crisis stage, or is it still ahead?
Well, a fourth turning is an era. So it's an era in which much happens, and it's not like an endless nonstop crisis. I mean, if you think of an era lasting for 20 odd years, right? There's going to be a lot of peaks and valleys and so on. I think that the initial catalyst of the turning was the 2008 crash. I think the next thing we're looking for, which we haven't seen yet, is what we call the regeneracy, and that's when after a period of time when things begin to get worse, the society begins to coalesce around certain agendas, certain kinds of institutions to radically fix what's the problem. And after that comes a climax, typically, when the problem gets worse, even while we're trying with increasing fervency to solve it. And then ultimately at the very end of a fourth turning, and we might be looking here in the late 2020s, right, or 2030, right? So we're looking way out. Ultimately, at the very end of an era like that, is the resolution. That's when the treaties are signed and the new institutions are unveiled, and that's a time usually when suddenly the institutions which are being rebuilt and reshaped at a very rapid speed, history is moving very rapidly, suddenly all the concrete hardens. And then in the decades after that, it becomes very difficult to change anything again. So you think of coming out of our last fourth turning, where we completely reshaped, man's relationship to technology, government's relationship to the economy. We set up the IMF and the World Bank and the UN and NATO and all these huge we just completely redefined our role around the world, and then it kind of set in stone after that, right? It's an interesting to think that this is how we measure our social time, is when we're looking in politics and geopolitics and the economy, we tend to talk about post-war, right? Do you ever notice that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what's the what's happening in the post-war era. So even today, we measure things from the end of World War II. Interestingly, when we talk about cultural history, we talk about values and the kinds of art, we often are less likely to say post-war than we say post-60s. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You know, post. That was the second turning. So these two kinds of turnings are kind of when we kind of reset our odometer to year zero, right? And I think in the culture, we reset our odometer to year zero in the late 60s or mid 70s or something like that. Because if you take a look at any cultural artifact, any movie, any picture, any advertisement, even if you didn't know anything else about it, you'd probably be able to tell me whether it was created before or after those dates.
So time-wise, when would be the next time that we would be seeing the culture being reset?
Wow. Well, that's going to be even further into the future. So that's going to be probably out. That's going to be sometime in the 2040s.
All right, so the fourth turning, this is going to run up into the late 2020s, early 2030s.
Well, that's when it will end.
Yes, that's
and
what
then
I mean.
We'll have a period that will run through perhaps maybe the very end of the 2020s, 2030s, and then maybe, halfway into the 2040s. And then we'll have the next second turning. That will be the huge entropic, divisive, angry, tumultuous, institution weakening backlash against everything that's been built. Largely, by the way, by all these millennials who will then be in right midlife, right? They'll be running this thing, and so they'll have all these big left-brained institutions. They'll have, everything will be digital. Everything, you'll have all these digital things that'll be taking care of life for us, and their kids will lash out against that. I can already see it coming.
And spiritually, when would we see the next spiritual awakening? That's it right there?
That's the awakening.
That's like in the 2040s.
That'll be in the 2040s. But it's not going to be a nice time. I mean, these awakenings are always time of rising personal risk-taking, rising substance abuse, rising crime. One of the things people don't realize is all the great awakenings of American history have always coincided with social disorder, not with social order. And they've always been spearheaded by the young.
It's a very interesting point. Do these rules apply worldwide, or is it just Western civilization?
I think they do. I'm increasingly, give talks on this abroad, and we see a great degree of parallelism between generations in the United States, generations, and obviously English-speaking generations around the world, generations throughout Europe, including Russia, and particularly in East Asia. I think China in particular, but also the sort of affiliated kind of culturally, Confucian societies of that region. We see generally a very similar pacing. I mean, they all had a great kind of hero archetype coming out of World War II, either because they won the war or because they rallied the country even though they lost. The Great Patriotic War generation in Russia, the Long March generation in China, and so on, are kind of RGIs. They all had a war child generation. In Britain, they call this the air raid generation. These are little kids, and during the Blitz. And it's interesting, that generation is mostly passed from power, as they have here in the United States. But they were a generation responsible for creating some of the more process-oriented, tension-reducing, peace-enforcing institutions around the world. This is a generation, for instance, people like Jacques Delors, who created the European Union. And they were the ones who really, scorched by war as kids, they were the ones who wanted to make sure that no one, no European country would go to war again, right? So that was a very important mission for them. In China, this was often called This has often been called the third generation. This is the generation of the generation of engineers who learned from Russian textbooks, who later became leaders, just after Deng Xiaoping passed away. And then Jiang Zemin would have been, kind of an archetypal example of that during the 1990s. The next generation in Europe and around the world was very much like boomers. And in fact, in Europe, this was called in France, it was called les 68ers. This was the 68ers. In Germany, they called them die 68er. This is, again, 68, the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Brigade, a lot of violence, a lot of Euro terrorism, a lot of the new lifestyles that we associate with the 60s in America certainly happened in Europe to seismic effect. In China, this was the Red Guard generation. They gave us the Cultural Revolution, which involved the shattering of everything traditional in Chinese culture. We see a Generation X globally, maybe a few years delayed in Europe and China, the same love of cities, deal-making, hip-hop. And around the world, we see the emergence of a new millennial generation. In China, they're called the little emperors, very protected kids. They're behind bars, so they don't wander out in the streets. They're all in uniform. They're doing exams all the time. And the saying in China is this is the generation that never knew bitterness, never tasted bitterness. And I think they're regarded much, in some ways, like millennials are here, very programmed, very protected, spoiled, and very trusting, more trusting than older generations of institutions and leadership, particularly in China. We do see many of the same trends, and I think you're beginning to see some of the same mood in some of these places. Interesting, we see such strong currents now fragmenting the European Union and pulling it apart, now that the generation that really created it and saw the need to create it has really passed from the scene, right? And we will see where that goes. My belief is that as is no different from that of many other economists and experts who look at the European Union. You cannot have a currency union which does not also have a political and fiscal union, and I just think it's unviable. And so I am not sanguine about the long-term survival of the euro. Whether or not the EU will remain in place in some form as kind of an alliance, a loose alliance of some sort, that may still be possible. But I do see huge centripetal forces there. And, you're looking at areas where conflict can start. East Asia. And we don't have time to talk about that, I'm sure, but the generational tensions there, anyone who looks at war cycles will tell you that the time when wars are usually declared are the times when the generation that doesn't remember the last war becomes the senior leaders, right? And right now you have every country now, a major country in Asia, has a senior leader, charismatic, more nationalist than his predecessor, who has no memory of the last war. And this is Modi in India. This is Xi Jinping, obviously in China, and it's
and we're seeing
Abe in Japan and Park Geun-hye in South Korea.
Yeah, and we're seeing the young bucks come up in the ranks of the PLA, becoming the new commanding officers, and they want to prove their stuff.
Of course they do.
They're ready to go to war.
And look at all the young people who are supporting Abe. That's kind of really interesting, right? So that Abe's biggest supporters of his efforts to push for a more nationalistic Japan, the most outspoken leaders are the youth and the very young adults. It's not the middle-aged people.
All right, last question. We're almost out of time. You and Dr. Strauss were amazingly accurate in the fourth turning It was written in the 90s, and you projected into the future what would be happening. For example, you said that there would be a new Tea Party movement, and you were right. Looking out the next few years, what are you anticipating is going to happen?
I think the biggest news is going to be in the economy, and it's not going to be positive news. I think we see, medium term, the economy just has enormous threats. It's being held up by a bunch of forces which cannot last, and I see, the United States is it had the fiscal drag from a declining deficit. Now it has a drag from a rising current account deficit due to the high dollar, because everyone else is going into devaluation mode, right? And I don't see the U.S. economy as being as healthy as other people do. And I think that the high values of financial markets are being supported purely by monetary policy, which is why I do not believe you're going to see a September rate hike. And I think for the first time we are seeing the possibility, which is unusual historically, but I think it could happen this time, where a major financial crash could actually precipitate the next economic downturn. Normally it's the other way around, right? I mean, you get the economic downturn, and then you get the crash like we had in 2008. I think I could easily see it go the other way around now, and I see it getting closer because the valuations are higher than ever. Whether you look at the long-term PE or Tobin's Q or in any of these things that people ought to be looking at for long-term historical valuations, combine that now with the fact that that last 2 quarters, according to the NEPA statistics, you actually now have declining earnings. We haven't seen that before, and the S&P 500 is now generally showing Q2 earnings actually to be down by some 4.5%. So that's new. We haven't seen that in the last few years. So you're going to have now not only the valuations high to start with, but now earnings are declining. And let me tell you, earnings are so out of whack in terms of their share of national income. We've never seen such high earnings as a share of national income. And they tend to rise and fall in broad sweeps. Well, if the decline in earnings, if that continues down or accelerates down just to its historical mean, reversion just to its historical mean, and PE ratios don't change, that could be easily a 30 or 40% decline in the S&P 500. So I think we're in an extremely vulnerable position in our markets, and we're there because we have done everything possible to stimulate through monetary policy an economy which is suffering from underdemand and lack of popular and public confidence.
What about civil unrest, public rebellion against what's happening in the economy?
I don't see that, but I do see the possibility of violence elsewhere in the world having a negative effect. And if I see the biggest external factor, an external event that can influence the global economy is China. I still think that is. I think that's a much bigger danger than Greece, say.
Possibility of a third party in 2016?
Only if we get huge news in the economy between now and then. Is that true? Although I will say, it's not often that we have wide open slates in both parties, and the incumbent party. I regard Hillary Clinton is a lot weaker than other people do. I think you could easily see there's a vacuum there. You could easily see other candidates coming in to fill that space. All
right. Wish we had more time. We went a full hour here, and I got a lot more questions. My guest, Dr. Neil Howe, is co-author of The Fourth Turning. Thank you so much. Appreciate you spending the hour with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.